everyone, and welcome to Rika Studio. My name is Serena, and today we will be experimenting and making coasters using some fun watercolor techniques. Okay, let's get started. The watercolors I'm going to be using today are Winsor Newton Cotman Watercolor Compact Set. I love this set because it comes with brushes, a pan, and it's great for travel and doing sketches. To practice these techniques, I'm going to be using Canson's cold pressed watercolor paper, 2 cups of water, salt, and rice. First thing I did was tape down my paper using painter's tape. Then I traced a circular object to create 7 circles. Since I'm using a pan set, I need to activate my watercolors by giving them some water. You can also do this with a spray bottle, which would be easier, but a brush works fine too. For the first technique, we're going to create a gradient wash using one color. Since we created a circle, it will start to look like a sphere. I've loaded up my brush with a vermilion and started to apply it to the paper, starting dark at the bottom, and gradually it'll get lighter at the top. The first thing you want to know about watercolors is it's all about the ratio of pigment to water. The more water you add, the lighter the color will be. With less water, the color will be darker. To create the illusion of light and shadow for this sphere, we have to think about the light source, which for me is coming from the right corner down onto my sphere. You want to go ahead and put your darkest areas first, and then lighten up as you go on the outer rim. Another thing to know is the white of the page. It's going to be our lightest part of the sphere, and so we're not going to actually paint on it. What I'm doing now is I'm going to go ahead and add some more darker color, darker pigment to the bottom half to make it look more like a sphere. In case you put too much color or a darker shade onto your painting, you can always lift it up using a drier brush. This next watercolor technique is a textured wash, and I like to use this one a lot in my visual journals. You want to use less water and more color or pigment to create kind of that brushstroke texture. It also helps if you add multiple colors, change the direction of your brush strokes and the sizes of your brushes. In a sketchbook page, it helps activate the space and gives a more interesting background. In my textured wash, I decided to use analogous colors, which are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So I started with a dark blue, I did some blue greens, a teal, and some yellow greens as well. Our next technique is called wet to wet gradient, and it just means that the watercolor is wet and our paper is wet. It's similar to the first gradient wash but with 2 colors, and our paper has a thin layer of water. It is also handy to have 2 cups of water. 1 cup is used to clean off your brush, the other one is used for clean water and for the wet to wet technique. So using a little bit of water, I started adding a darker color to the top of the circle. You'll then go ahead and dip your brush into more water to dilute the pigment to lighten the next few strokes. And I did that all the way to the middle part of my circle. I then repeated my steps with a different color, and I chose blue for this one. So I started off darker at the bottom, and then as I gradually got up, I added a little bit more water to my blue for a lighter tint. And then once I got to the middle, I added just some more water. And looking back on this, I think I should have waited until it dried. Another reason could be the fact that I use student grade paper, which is typically machine made, making it cheaper, but it's also easy and prone to warping and deterioration when wet. So I went ahead and added another layer of blue and then went back in with a drier, cleaner brush to kind of mix the 2 colors together. Our next technique is called wet to wet textured print. And so what I did was, instead of starting with water, I added a layer of watercolor paint. And so I used yellow. And the interesting thing about yellow is that it is one of those colors that on the color wheel is naturally light. And so you have to add a color, whether it's like a brown or a red, to kind of make it darker. And so that's what I went ahead and did. So I added some red, I added a little bit of the vermilion on top of it. I didn't want to smear it too much because this is actually going to show up much better when we do our print. Next, you kind of want to get some saran wrap, and it can be any sort of saran wrap or any plastic. And what you want to do is just scrunch it on top of your watercolor paper and let it dry, and it'll create some beautiful textures once we take it off. Our next technique is called the wet into wet explosion texture, and my students absolutely love this. And so the first thing you want to do is go ahead and wet your paper with some clean water. Go ahead and load your brush up with a color of your choice, and I chose green. And you're going to use the tip of your brush, and you're just going to dab it into the wet ground. And as you see, it kind of creates a little explosion. Looks a little bit like cauliflower or a tree. I just love this technique. It is so addicting. You don't want to overdo the colors. You kind of want to let them bleed a little bit, but not too much. Up next is the infamous salt technique. So today we're going to be using kosher salt, and it is a wet into wet technique, but you can also use it as kind of a wet into dry technique. As long as you have a wet surface, this should work with any type of salt. Even though today we're using kosher salt, this will work with table salt, Himalayan salt, coarse salt. It's more about the timing and how wet your paper is to make sure that you receive the right texture. For this one, I went ahead and kind of created a little bit of a landscape with some browns on the bottom, and went ahead and added some tans, so that you can go ahead and kind of see it as like flowers. So when the salt dries, it'll absorb the paint and leaving blank textured designs at the bottom. And immediately you can kind of see the paints kind of float towards the salt. For our last and final one, we did the rice texture, which is very similar to the salt one. You do need kind of a nice wet background. I went ahead and started adding layers. I wanted to create an underwater landscape, so I went ahead and started creating layers of mountain ridges and coral, more water, more ocean waves. Changing up the intensity of the watercolor and the pigments. I wanted to give it a little bit of variety. Teal, this part was going to be the lightest part of the little painting. Now we'll go ahead and add the rice by sprinkling it. And it kind of went a little bit everywhere, but it's okay, I was kind of experimenting. At this point I didn't realize that my paper wasn't wet enough, so I went ahead and added a little bit more water, just so that I could actually see the rice absorbing and starting to create that texture. Yay, and there we have it, our 7 basic watercolor textures. As always, watercolor always dries lighter, so the colors will change and the salt and the rice will be kind of stuck to the page. So you kind of want to like scrape that off with like I'm using my nails. You can also use like a credit card or one of those scrapers. Oh, I love how the rice turned out. And that water was kind of a good thing, but you can also see that it kind of pulled in some areas, so I'm probably going to turn those into like little fish or some sort of sea creatures. Alright, this is my favorite part. We're going to be using some watercolor pencils. I have a Sakura travel brand, and it comes with like a water brush, and it comes with a little bit of water container and some color pencils. And so what we're going to do is we're just going to go in and add some details and kind of see what shapes pop out. I think one kind of looked not as dynamic as I wanted it to be, so I'm going to go ahead and add in some more shapes. I see like a lot of triangles, and so the beauty with these watercolor pencils is you can like layer them just like you would with any other color pencils, but they're actually pigment. They're actually watercolor pigment. So you can paint them, you can turn them into paint. So as you kind of already know, I was not a big fan of the dual color gradation. It just didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. Anyway, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and fix it with some watercolor pencils by adding a design on top of it. I wanted to keep it like a sphere, So I wanted to make sure that the lines were curved on the design to make it look like the design was wrapped around the ball. So I decided to give a little bit more definition to the salt painting with some leaves and some stems and just maybe a little bit around the flowers. The amazing part about the watercolor techniques is that there are just so many applications. You can use them in the subject matter. You can use them to create any sort of fuzzy effect. And I think I'm still finding out ways that I can use the salt techniques. So I kind of like the way that the rice soaked up a lot of the space and left a lot of white. It kind of bled through, and that's the thing with watercolors, that it's not going to be perfect. For this one, I decided to go ahead and use paint again. I decided to use some watercolors, and I wanted to apply a little bit more layering. And with layering, you're letting the paint dry underneath, and then you're applying another layer that's going to make it darker. You can control how dark something is. You can even adjust the color, as you'll probably see right here. My favorite part about using the rice and salt technique is looking into the spaces and trying to find something to pull out. I ask myself a bunch of questions like, or what can I, add and create. So I created a little turtle and some little fish, and I think that's the most fun part. So I'm not a very tight, detailed painter when it comes to watercolor. I normally use watercolor as a medium to play around and to get sketches down really well for when I'm traveling. And that's about it. So we have our gradient wash, a textured wash, the dual color wet into wet wash, wet into wet printed texture, the wet into wet explosion texture, and the salt and the rice technique. All right, everyone, that's it for today. Hope you had some fun experimenting and playing with some watercolors. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. And thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. If you want to see more painting techniques, please like and subscribe for more content. Hope to see you again next time.